Welcome to the Worship Central course. We all long to grow as worship leaders and musicians, but how do we do this? In this session, we're looking at the practicalities of leading worship. I remember the first time I ever led anyone in worship. I'd just become a Christian a few months earlier, and I joined a small group at HGB, our local church. It was a Tuesday, and I got a desperate phone call about 5 p.m. from the small group leader to say that the worship leader was ill, and she tried everybody else, and I was the only person left. Could I lead worship that night? Ever since I'd come to faith a few months earlier, I would spend hours sitting in my room trying to play guitar and worshiping God. But the thought of having to lead others in worship was absolutely terrifying. Anyway, there were no other options, so I agreed. My skill on the guitar was limited to 2 chords, the G chord and the C chord.
So no change there.
No change there, thank you. I only knew one song which had 4 chords, but that wasn't stopping me. Again, no change there. As we began the time of worship, something extraordinary started to happen. I was convinced the Spirit of God was powerfully at work, because after about 2 minutes, the group began to rotate into the corridor outside the room. They were taking it in turns to come in and out, and full of faith, I presume that revival must have been breaking out on the street outside. Perhaps there was a spontaneous crowd gathering. Perhaps there were people coming forward wanting to give their lives to Christ. I was so convinced things were going really well. I carried on for about another 15 minutes, singing the same song with only half the needed chords. They were such an encouraging small group that it was only years later that I found out what was really going on. It was so painfully tuneless that it was actually really funny. Rather than laugh in front of me, they were so nice, they left the room to collapse into fits of hysterics in the corridor. And when they composed themselves and stopped laughing, they'd come back in and try and keep worshipping. Thankfully, they didn't let on how bad it had been, but kept encouraging me to keep going. Leading others in worship can be a challenging responsibility. Standing up in front of a group of people, wearing your heart on your sleeve, making yourself vulnerable, it's not an easy job. It takes time, patience, practice, and lots of prayer to move on from the kind of tricky first experience that so many of us share. But whether we've had a bumpy start or not, if we're involved in the worship life of our local church, then we're worship leaders. If we're leading, singing, playing an instrument, serving up front, or behind the scenes, then we will be helping lead people into the presence of Jesus by what we do. Forget the idea that it's only the person up front who's the worship leader. All of us as musicians and team members need to have a sense of ownership, commitment, and responsibility towards what we do. And all of us must see it as a holy and serious calling. We're going to look at 3 practical questions that apply regardless of our context, model, or style of service. These questions apply to all of us, and taken together, they will help us grow and develop as worship leaders.
The first question to ask is, how are we preparing? There's something that unites sporting legends, astounding singers, and brilliant performers. The more effortless they appear, the greater the amount of work and preparation they have done. And so it is with leading worship. If we want to be effective, we need to work hard behind the scenes. Before leading a time of worship, we need to ask ourselves, how are we preparing both spiritually and practically? It involves both prayer and practice. When we think about preparation, there are 2 extremes to avoid. Firstly, we've got to avoid making it all about the music and the visuals, to spend hours tweaking and testing only to finally get around to praying just minutes before the service starts. That's just not going to work. Without realizing it, we develop a culture within a team where people rely primarily on their own strengths and gifts rather than on God. The other extreme is to avoid, for a worship team, not to rehearse at all, but to rely solely on prayer. They gather to pray before the service, thinking that they don't need to prepare practically. The team may have impressive depth of spirituality and passion, but as they lead, if the musicians play out of tune, out of time, making frequent horrible mistakes, a congregation will struggle to engage in worship. And as worship leaders, we need to value both spiritual and practical preparation. Then there's private before public. John Wesley was once asked to describe how he balances prayer life with his busy schedule of preaching and outreach. And he replied, "Every morning I set myself on fire for Jesus, then I go out and people watch me burn." Imagine what the impact on the local church would be if every worship team spent time before every session seeking God passionately in prayer and private worship, as well as in musical and practical preparation. The influence on the worshiping life of the church would be amazing. As leaders of worship, one of the greatest gifts we can give to our churches is that of being spiritually alive and fresh. There are no shortcuts here to developing authentic spirituality. It comes down to the important and obvious disciplines, such as reading God's word, spending time in his presence through prayer. If we have no private cry, then how can we stand up in front of others pretending that we do? Worship leading involves taking our private cry and making it public.
Another important consideration is picking the right songs that will help people respond to God in a worshipful and meaningful way. There's more to it than throwing together the 5 most popular songs of the week. Firstly, find a theme. A theme can bring a focus to a time of worship. A few songs clustered around a particular theme provides a sense of direction and a sense of journey for the congregation. As you pull together your set list, ask yourself whether there is a clear theme being developed throughout the lyrics of the songs. Themes such as God's sovereignty, his mercy, his faithfulness, his creation, or his heart for justice. Let's not just jump randomly from one song to another. Second, balance substance with simplicity. We are called to worship God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength. It's essential, therefore, to have songs that inspire and stretch our minds in worship, songs that are rich in content. But our worship is not merely with our minds. It must also stir the heart. Paul talks about this to the church in Corinth, saying, I will sing with my spirit, but I will also sing with my mind. So we need to get the balance right. Third, keep it fresh. Introducing new songs can help here. So be on the lookout for new material and think through how you can flow these new songs within your more familiar repertoire. Fresh doesn't have to mean new though. Singing an old hymn or a song that hasn't been used for a while can be just as powerful. I often find this as Tim's songs. Finding new and interesting arrangements that use the best of the old hymns and the best of the latest contemporary worship songs creates a great balance. Fourth, think about whom we're leading. The context will have an impact on the songs we choose, the style of service or the equipment we use. Obviously, weddings have different requirements to, let's say, a youth celebration. Or if you're leading on Alpha with lots of people who've never been to church, you would choose different songs to the ones you would choose perhaps on a normal Sunday. A Canadian friend of ours was leading worship at an event. Just before he stood up to lead, a video was shown highlighting the plight of the victims of human trafficking. Now, our friend had momentarily popped out of the room and completely missed a very serious and emotional moment. Unaware of what had happened, he returned to the stage with a big grin on his face and clicked into Happy Day. Needless to say, it was a complete disaster. If you're leading when the service is focused on issues of poverty, suffering, and injustice, it's probably a good idea not to start with Happy Day.
Hey.
Well, you know. Some songs work brilliantly with a great band and an excellent sound system, but don't always work so well in someone's living room. In these small gatherings, people understandably feel more vulnerable and exposed during worship. Our role as worship leaders is to enable people to feel secure and free to bring an offering of worship. If they spend the evening terrified their voice may crack or that people will laugh if they're out of tune, then they might not engage in worship in the same way. In smaller settings, it often works better to use simpler songs, particularly songs that are easy to memorize. It often is helpful to pitch songs in a lower key, making them more comfortable for everyone to sing.
The second question to ask is, what is God doing? At every moment, on every occasion, in every context, during every time of worship we need to be asking God what he's doing, where he's leading, and how we should respond. We should never just assume or switch off. God has a plan and a purpose for our gathered meetings that he is keen to share with us. Our role is to tune into this and obediently follow. Generally speaking, there are 3 ways we can lead worship. The first is badly led worship, where basic mistakes are made, songs are sung out of tune, the choice of songs seems unimaginative and random. People are distracted by the glaring mistakes, and it's really difficult for people to enter in. The second is good solid worship, where the basics are done well. For instance, the band is led effectively The songs are well thought through and the congregation can easily respond. Now, for many of us, this is where we end up settling, but there is so much more. The third way is to be Spirit-led. This has little to do with style, form, or tradition, but rather here, there is a deep and dynamic exchange between the Holy Spirit and the congregation. It is here that we see breakthrough, where we see lives change, vision birthed, and passion fueled. But we can't make it happen simply by reading a book or taking a course. It takes time. We have to wait in God's presence and practice the art of listening to the leading of the Spirit, allowing Him to fill us with power and love, even as we lead worship. It also involves us allowing space in our worship for God's Spirit to move, to not hold the reins so tightly that we try to drive our agenda through. With all the pressure of playing with a band, remembering chords, words, watching and trying to observe a congregation's response in worship, we can forget to ask this important question: what is God doing? But it's often when asking this question that perhaps a thought pops into our minds. Maybe it's a different song. Sometimes it's a line to sing out. Perhaps it can be an encouragement to worship in silence. It's as we step out in this that we learn and grow and begin to see God at work. In discerning what God is doing, we need to tread the balance between being pastors and prophets. We need the prophetic to move people on in worship. We need to take risks, allowing space and time for God to take control. However, if the prophetic is unchecked, we can leave people feeling confused, even fearful. At the same time, the pastoral without the prophetic can result in a church stagnating. We want to see churches moving forward in worship, whilst at the same time taking as many people along with them as possible.
Another thing to remember is that you are there to lead worship, not just songs. If we want to be led by the Spirit, we can't just be the kind of person who selects the songs, rehearses the exact arrangements, and has all the worship tied up before the congregation has even gathered, never swerving from the set list no matter what goes on. Worship is so much more than this. It's an encounter with the Lord of heaven. It's a heartfelt response to His initiating love. We can't simply close our eyes and turn off our monitors and forget there's a group of people that we're meant to be leading and going on a journey together. Obviously, we need to be able to see the people we're leading, watching out for signs of how and when they're responding or not responding, when they seem to be engaging or disengaging. As worship leaders, it's almost as if we have to have one eye on the Lord and one eye on the people. As we lead worship, we need to regularly open our eyes to see what's happening around us. You still worship with your eyes open. It doesn't kill a holy moment. Presumably at Pentecost, somebody had their eyes open to see and record where God moved in great power and when people were responding. But during a time of leading worship, it's helpful to note some simple observations on how people are entering in. For example, how are people responding in terms of the level of singing and involvement? If you look out and there's a sea of blank expressions and it seems the congregation has no pulse whatsoever, then we need to ask ourselves some questions. Are we singing too many new, unfamiliar songs? Are we relying on the same songs we've used for the last month without changing anything? Are people just bored? Maybe the band is too loud, drowning people out. Or it might be the band is too quiet, making people feel self-conscious and awkward and unable to sing and engage. When things get really tough, it's often helpful to return to a familiar song that you know works really well for your church. If people are still disengaged after singing this, then take time to think and pray afterwards. It might be the church is going through a dry season. Perhaps the people need to be encouraged and affirmed. Worship is both caught and taught. If we really believe that worship is our highest calling and therefore our first priority, then we need to be continually teaching our congregations on the subject of worship, what it is and how we can respond in both the private and the corporate setting.
We need to model worship if people are going to catch a vision for it, and we need to teach into it. This is where the relationship between the worship leader and the senior church leader is so important. Having times together to discuss the spiritual climate of the church is a key aspect of team leadership. I remember leading a particular congregation regularly in worship where the response always seemed so minimal. Every time I'd leave the stage, I'd feel so frustrated and angry. And during the sermon, I'd be quietly fuming and complaining to God. And on one such Sunday where things had been particularly tough, I started moaning to God. My assumptions was that he too must feel really angry and disappointed in the congregation's lack of response in sung worship. And in the midst of my angst and gripes, God challenged me saying, Tim, I love this church. I love these people, and I want you to love them too. I felt convicted, and from that day on would pray, God, give me compassion for these people. Help me to love them. And it was over weeks and months, something shifted in my heart, and I'm sure the congregation began to notice. Rather than lead aggressively when people were slow to respond, I began to lead with a sensitivity and a grace which I believe God had given. And as I led with a new sense of love, the congregation began to respond with fresh passion and vigor. When we feel discouraged by the apparent apathy or disconnect of a congregation, it can be so easy to start leading out of frustration. But we are called to feed the sheep, not beat them. We need to pray that God would give us his grace to keep loving and serving.
Final question then. Where are we growing? It's key to understand that when we're leading worship, we give out physically, emotionally, and spiritually. When we fail to take time being replenished, we are in danger of finding ourselves sinking spiritually and even making errors of judgment and poor life choices. So we need to find time to recharge. Many of us will be lost without our phones. We become reliant on them for our work and daily routines, but without recharging them on a daily basis, they become redundant and of no use. Through this regular, essential discipline of taking time to recharge, our lives will become synced with God's purposes and plans. It's kind of like a regular software update, that our souls become refreshed and renewed by the Spirit of God. Spiritually, nothing brings more refreshment than time in Jesus' presence. In Mark's Gospel, we see the 12 disciples return from being sent out to preach the good news and pray for the sick and the oppressed. As they gather around Jesus, exhausted by their travels and ministry, many other people join them, perhaps hoping to be prayed for and hear more of the teaching. The disciples were so pressed by the crowds of people, they didn't even have time to eat. In the stress and the chaos, Jesus takes time and takes charge of the 12. And he says, come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest. For some of us, we need to heed Jesus' words, getting time out to rest in his presence, learning the art of remaining and abiding in Christ. It's deeply practical advice. For this reason, praying together as a team before and after services is key. It's a great way to thank God for all that he's done. It's also a helpful reminder that ultimately our worship is all from him and it's all to him. But it's also an opportunity to pray for ourselves, to ask that God would pour into us after we've been giving out. This prayer is so timely and important.
We also need to develop a sustainable rhythm. Rick Warren speaks of a rhythm of ministry that allows space to recharge. He encourages people to divert daily, withdraw weekly, and abandon annually. Divert daily means finding time to switch off from work, go for a run, enjoy a good meal, watch a film, perhaps even read a newspaper. By allowing a period of rest each day, we keep awake and alert to serve God. Withdraw weekly means taking a period of time off, perhaps a day or two, a few afternoons, or whatever works best for you. In this time, maybe turn the phone off, spend a day with great friends, do something fun, relax. Finally, abandon annually. It connects with the truth that we all benefit from a great holiday every year. It's often during these times away from the busyness that we get fresh perspective and that God speaks clearly about future direction. We also need to learn to embrace feedback. As we gain experience and reach a level where we are quite comfortable leading worship, there's a danger that we stop reflecting on what we're involved in. But one of the exciting aspects of leading worship is that there are always ways we can grow and develop. There is always more to learn. We should always be asking our team, what can we do better? What worked? What didn't? And we need to be really ready for the answer. We need to embrace constructive criticism because it is the only way we will grow. It's essential we never lose a hunger to be the very best we can be. Part of this involves perhaps your senior leaders to point out areas that you can be strengthened in your terms of your worship leading. For some of us, this process can be hard. We may find it difficult not to take things personally. We might miss all the encouragements and focus on that one negative. Some of us have served in churches where we've been unfairly and harshly criticized. We've maybe been stung by the pain and harsh words spoken over us. But the truth is that we will always face criticism, some helpful, some just plain abusive and destructive. If it's constructive, then there will be things we can take and learn and embrace. And if it's harsh, then we need to learn to handle it well. And there are two positive ways of approaching this. Firstly, we can try and find that one kernel of truth in the criticism. Even if the comment was meant to harm, as you reflect on it, you might see some small element of truth that you can work on. Second, if after reflection there's no truth whatsoever in someone's criticism and it is simply vindictive and spiteful, well, Jesus promises to bless us. In Matthew 5, he says, "Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me." Great leadership is the art of keeping going despite the setbacks and discouragements. Winston Churchill, he defined success as the ability to go from one failure to another with no loss of enthusiasm.
Finally, we need to build a team of worshippers who will encourage one another, who spur each other on to grow, develop, and thrive. As we close, St. Paul writes this: "Be devoted to one another in love. Honor one another above yourselves. Never be lacking in zeal, but keep your spiritual fervor, serving the Lord. Be joyful in hope, patient in affliction, faithful in prayer." Leading worship is the most amazing privilege. Our hope is that right now, God's Spirit will equip us all as we serve the church. We believe that great times are ahead. The best is yet to come.